reform, with all the good intentions, do not always end up well. So reformations have good sort of intentions in the beginning, and the process sometimes starts is directed into the right direction, but then results are different. This is one thing that I want to extract from the detailed history of what I will tell you. And another thing is that Reformation is not really something that happens. Actually, it is a process, and sometimes, in fact, in the example of the Orthodox Church, I would say, or the Russian Orthodox Church, or maybe the Orthodox Church in general, it is an ongoing battle rather than a simple process. So, revolts in Russia, in the Russian Empire, started in February 1917, although there were also other examples, as you know, but we focus now on 1917. On March the 2nd, last Tsar of Russia, because the Tsar abdicated, and a provisional government was formed of major parties, headed by Prince Georgy Lvov. But Bolsheviks were unfortunately increasingly, this party, which is closely associated with the future Communist Party, the Bolsheviks were increasingly dominating this coalition. So immediately, now this is at that time, I come from Georgia, you heard it, not American Georgia, Caucasus, and Georgia at that time was a part of was annexed by the Russian Empire at the beginning of the 19th century, so it was part of the empire before the revolution, so revolution changed things. So as soon as the February Revolution happened and the structure in the state changed and Tsar abdicated, Georgians immediately founded a provisional government together with other Caucasian republics, which is Armenia and Azerbaijan. So this was Особый Закавказский комитет, which means Extraordinary Trans-Caucasian Committee, led by a constitutional Democrat, and the Georgians had their representative in this committee. The most important decision of that period, when this short period before it was dissolved in the same year, was abolition of the exarchate and restoration of autocephaly of the Orthodox Church of Georgia. Now, this is now also complex, but I'll try to explain it, that as soon as the Russian Empire annexed Georgia, beginning of the 19th century, in 10 years, they abolished, like this, empire abolished the independence of the church. Well, we've heard about, in the beginning, about the suppression of religious freedom in many ways, so this can be characterized as one of the ways in the beginning of the 19th century of suppression of religious freedom. Although Russian Empire was imposing the Orthodox Church, Orthodox faith, they were trying to bring this imperial power through crucifixion, in a way to abolish everything Georgian and among them the freedom or to decide for themselves, because autocephaly, it's a Greek word, means to decide by yourself, to govern yourself. So this was a big thing for a small nation like Georgia, to deprive it of its to deprive its church of autocephaly. So this the provisional government, as soon as it was founded in March, so it was founded in after the February Revolution. In March, they restored a Georgian council, Old Church Council, restored the autocephaly of the Orthodox Church of Georgia. Now, much more dramatic change worldwide, as well as for political situation in Georgia, came after the October Revolution. So you know there were twice revolutions in Russia. And this extraordinary Transcaucasian committee was already there. And but after the revolution, Georgia, the committee was dissolved, and Georgia declared in May the republic, so Democratic Republic. In 1918, it already declared the Democratic Republic. So in this, unfortunately, this didn't last long, because in 21 the Red Army came annexed again. It was the second annexation of Georgia, with the great help of the Bolsheviks, you know, the predecessors of communists, of Georgian origin. So, whether the revolution was a chance to reform or not, you know, because these were chances given by revolution, this is a really big question. And undeniably, around the time of the revolution, the progressive tendencies were in the air. And while these progressive powers were not able to win, is yet another big question. And it's awaiting a substantial answer from church historians, not only church historians, but in general historians. So now I will bring to your attention the struggle between the two powers on the example of the local council of the Russian Orthodox Church. I'll explain now what is this, which took place almost simultaneously with the revolutions in Russia. So for decades, the church was preparing, the Russian Orthodox Church, which by then had annexed the Georgian church as well, so Georgian church didn't exist on its own. So for decades, there were preparations in the church, like at least from 1860s. The Russian Orthodox Church, some parts, I mean not the whole one, was preparing to introduce some reforms. Now, one of the biggest reforms that was introduced and was on the agenda was in restoration of the patriarchate. And I don't know now how relevant this is to your studies, but you know, Orthodox Church is governed by the head. You know, we don't have a pope. You know, there is no universal governance in Orthodox churches, but each Orthodox church, whether it's Serbian or Georgian, Russian, you know, each autocephalous Orthodox church has its own head. And so the Russian church, through the in the 18th century, lost its patriarchate, its head, through the reforms of Peter the Great. And this, the church was run or governed by the state. So actually the over-procurator, so-called, this was the title, was head of the church. So this created a specific situation in the church, as you understand, because it was also fully controlled, the church, by police, by special services. So this was a very unusual situation for the church to be so much, or officially, not only de facto, but also de juris, controlled by the state. So this was the major task on the agenda of the Moscow Council, Church Council, to restore the patriarchate, to return the church to its primordial sort of structure, to be governed by itself and not to be controlled fully by the state. Now, as a short excursus now, when I said, if you were following from the beginning, that the Russian Empire at the time of annexation of Georgian kingdoms, also abolished autocephaly as an empire where the church was controlled by the state. It was a legitimate move to do, because the church was part of the state. So the state, when it annexed this, another state, it made it a part of its own, did whatever they wanted, because it was the empire, and that's how empires act. But then the revolution changed this scenario, and so gave this opportunity. Now we are still in the 1917, when the revolutions are happening in Russia, and also in August, so before the October Revolution, the Moscow Local Council starts. And it is a very big event. It involved very many people. It was a very interesting, it was really, it had a lot of progressive elements in it, because first and foremost, from my perspective, was that out of 564 members, so more than 500 members of the council, more than a half, 299, were lay people. So, and unfortunately among the lay people, this was more than 500. What the question is related to what I'm saying? No, you were asking something. No, okay, that's okay. No, I'm a teacher, so I'm used to control. So more than half were lay people. This is still a big question, as we know, in Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church, or whether the lay people should be part of the decision-making or not. And certainly the question is not anymore whether they should be or not, but how to make them part. Now, at the dawn of the revolution, October Revolution, very interesting. You should be, if you study this period, because revolution then and the Soviet Union and everything, this was all disastrous for decades. But at this time, the understanding of what was happening varied very much. And for instance, one of the archbishops of the Russian Orthodox Church, when these revolutions, in between the revolutions, in 1917, this is Archbishop Serafim Chichigov, who was then executed in a very bad way, called this a period of fighting for dignity and honor of Russia. See, this is all controversial in a way. So some people were interpreting what was happening this in a positive way, because it was a window towards a change, towards reformation. But then certainly when the bloodshed was very strong, then the church, the council was making strong statements against it and trying to prevent this. But some progressive people in the church or among the lay people were having this not only positive, but were optimistic about the upcoming changes. So was the head of the provisional government, Prince Lvov, who actually pushed this Moscow local council and made it to see the subsequent reforms in the church. In spite of the circumstances under which the council took place, the council took into account many details of the church. So I mentioned the most important thing, that the patriarchate was restored, but it also discussed at length many details of the church life. There were 22 different sections working on various issues, and one of the sections was busy or was occupied by looking at the situation with the Orthodox Church of Georgia. Because since 1905, when the Russian Empire issued the Freedom of Consciousness Pact, then the so-called autocephalists in Georgia, still within the Russian Empire in 1905, started to organize themselves as a group to propose to the state and the church, which was run by the state, how to remove this curse on their own church, how to restore the autocephaly. So according to the Russian scholars of today, abolishing of autocephaly by the Synod of the Russian Orthodox Church in 1811 was ecclesiastically uncanonical, but it was the emperor's will when it happened, so it happened. And although majority of canon lawyers around the time of 1917, when the council was taking place, and canon lawyers, church canon lawyers were certainly part of it, agreed on that there wasn't on the illegitimacy of the abolition of the autocephaly. There was no agreement on how it should have been restored. So how, according to the national principle, which means all Georgians belong to the on the territory of Georgia, all Georgians belong to the Georgian church, and the rest belong to the Russian church, or according to the territorial principle. So in other way, everyone, all Orthodox who live in Georgian territory, because it says in the traditionally Orthodox country, should be part of the Orthodox Church of Georgia. So another issue at the stake was church property, which is always a very difficult issue, as we know, especially that the Russian state, it's interesting, owned the church property, because the fact of abolishing the church status by the state in Russia, because after restoration of patriarchate, the state was not anymore officially in charge of the Orthodox Church of Russia. Even though, and in spite of that, the church property provided by the state before to the Church of Georgia could not be released to the church. See? So this was a very confusing matter, how to divide the property which once was belonged to the state, and then overnight almost it was unclear where it went. So in fact, by the beginning of the council, in August, the church in Georgia already declared autocephaly, which Russian church did not recognize until 1943. And this is a period, if you are a little bit aware of the history of the Soviet Union, it was the Second World War, but also it's a period of Stalin's dominion. Okay, and so the Church of Georgia, which achieved this goal that it wanted very much to achieve, the restoration of autocephaly, found itself marginalized and oppressed under the new rules. Certainly when in 1921 the Red Army entered Georgia, the church was not very much taken into account. However, this was also a dilemma for the hierarchs in the Georgian church, because in the Church of Georgia, because they've been trained, they trained themselves, let's say, into this discourse that Church of Georgia was a national church. So restoration of autocephaly for them was not a canonical matter. For them it was also a matter of national but national significance, because it was the national church. So the church was on January 12th, so 21, Red Army entered the Georgian territory and established its rule. And in January 1923, all members of the Church Council of the Orthodox Church of Georgia were arrested. So now that was, now Red Army is there and the Soviets are in action. So the major accusation against the council, Church Council, was sending an appeal to Genoa Conference, again we come to Italy and Genoa, by the Church Council, signed by the Patriarch and all members. Now what was the case? The Genoa Conference is known as a peace conference. It took place in April 10 to May 19th, 1922, and it was convened to discuss economic reconstruction of Central and Eastern Europe after the World War I, and to improve relations with the Bolshevik Russia, which was having severe economic problems. So the Bolsheviks were also interested in talking to the West immediately, because they had this period of famine, first period of famine under Bolshevik Russia. So following this famine in 21, the West speculated that the Bolsheviks regime would not live too long. But was not unfortunately true. So most importantly, the General Conference introduced new gold exchange standard. That's for Europe. But representatives from the Soviet Union participated in the meeting along with other 30 or so nations. And it was the first diplomatic attempt on the part of the Bolshevik Russia. They demanded cancellation of the Russian war debt, compensation for damages inflicted by the Allied forces, and credit for the government. They did not receive requested funds, but the USSR gained a political and economic pact with Germany, the Rapallo Treaty, and recognition in the European diplomacy. So the first thing. And to this meeting in 1922, the Georgian Church sent an appeal to help them. Because this new rule was not quite adequate, they thought, they were marginalizing them and they were not treating them well, also taking away the property, the church property, which after more than a century, they received eventually. So, certainly, as I said, post-Soviet historiography knows Genoa Conference as the peace conference, because it was the first attempt of making peace between the Bolsheviks and Bolshevik rule and the West. So starting diplomatic relations with the West for the Soviet could be seen as a part of the peace process, but as we noted, the West believed that the Soviet state would not disintegrate soon, this was not the reality. So the two parties had mutually exclusive interests in the Genoa Conference. Certainly, the Soviet authorities took harsh measures against the Church and the Patriarch when it was revealed that they sent a letter to the General Conference. Eventually, all members were arrested, and in the same, most churches following this were closed. In some districts, all churches were closed in Georgia. And one of the astonishing activities on the part of the Soviet government was taking out of the monastery in Western Georgia, Mozameta Monastery, near Kutaisi, the second biggest city in Georgia, relics of the 8th century local saints, you know, this tradition, Orthodox and the Catholic tradition to keep relics, to take these 8th century saints' relics, Brothers David and Constantine, and demoting them in a public court. So, and this was all over in the papers, you know. So this was a way, now a new way in Soviet reality to make fun of religious life and to really bring to fight against these sentiments in the people. Okay, I think I'm exhausting my time. So following the reforms or intended reforms, especially in the church, we see some extraordinary developments in the life of the church. The Russian church structure was justly restored, but it could not help to, but it didn't or could not help to work out a common understanding on such important ecclesiastical violation as the abolition of autocephaly, for example. In Georgia, the restoration of autocephaly was successful, but it fortified the nationalistic roots of the church more than anything else, because Georgian Republic was dissolved under the Red Army. And so, ironically, the autocephaly played a significant role during the Soviet regime, when it became the only marker of the Georgian national identity externally. So we are witnessing here in a very brief discourse, which cannot be exhausted in 30 minutes, but in 30 days, and because there are so many details coming from different aspects of life, church life, and life in general. So we are witnesses of these contradictions and controversies out of this reformation attempts. In the recent history, very recent history, since in the 21st century, we are also witnesses of more revolutions, colored revolutions or floral revolutions, but it is a big challenge to find balance between its agents, our people who want to make these revolutions, and the outside world on the one hand, and on the aims, initial aims of these revolutions and its further development. So I think truly from this perspective, especially with regard to church, reformation is not a single event. Reformation is in the life of the Orthodox Church is not a process, it's an ongoing battle.